Prison guards, what's the weirdest stuff you've seen while patrolling? Not me, but my dad. He worked the high-security ward at the state mental hospital. One day he's taking a census count and a patient calls him in because his eye hurts. Guy is sitting on his bed holding his eye, still attached to the ocular nerve, in his hand. And yes, the eye was pointed at my father. One WTF moment that wasn't sexual was this: one kid had collected newspapers and turned his cell into a human hamster cage. When we extracted him, he was balled up under his bunk like a hamster. The place even smelled like a hamster cage. Edit for spelling. I worked in a small jail in my home district. The most memorable character I had the pleasure, or rather dismay, of meeting was known around the jail as the Serpent. I kid you not, during shower time this guy would completely soap himself up and wiggle slide around the room, hissing violently. Lots of other great and significantly more disgusting stories, but that's the one which stood out for me the most. My mom is an RN at a prison. She said one dude peed in another guy's shoes, so the other guy peed on the initial pee perpetrator's face while he was asleep the following night. It was a literal pissing contest. My dad, now retired, used to manage the special needs unit of a state prison. This is where they put inmates who were deaf, wheelchair-bound, seriously mentally ill, developmentally challenged, etc., etc. One guy liked to tie his toothbrush to his shoelaces and wear it tucked into his shoe all the time. No. It wasn't a shiv. He just found that doing it kept the voices away. Another inmate worked in the cafeteria and liked to use the miniature powder donuts as demon binoculars to scan for, you guessed it, demons. He was super duper dark-skinned. The powdered sugar around his eyes really contrasted. I was a carer for about 8 months. I was doing a routine walkthrough of the block on night and found a guy walking around like a zombie. I tried to stop the guy, but he just kept going until I stepped in front of him. I found out from a few of the guys close to his bunk that he had been cheeking his seizure medication and decided to take a bunch of it at once. I ended up calling medical and having the guy taken outside of the prison to the hospital. I rode in the ambulance to the hospital where I had to stay in the room with the inmate, watch a catheter go in and watch his stomach get pumped. Also got to stand with the DR. While the guy was in a CAT scan. Was pretty cool watching the pictures of his brain scan come through. So I'm not a jail guard or anything, but I was in jail for a couple of days. Weird snafu with fingerprints or something caused me an extended stay after a night of a little too much fun. Anyway, I was put in population for a day, and when I got there I found a dude that exclaimed rather loudly that he'd suck a dick for a soup. Now I neither had soup, nor a reason to take him up on his offer, but about 3 hours later I noticed another inmate in a rather cheery mood, and the soup guy had a pack of ramen noodles in his hands. TLDR, people suck dick for soup in jail apparently. Not so much WTF as hey, interesting. Only been on the job for about a year at the time, been doing it a decade now, and I walk by this cell in Max. This inmate is making all these really short, stiff, jerky movements. So I finish my security check and ask an old-timer about it. Come to find out, the inmate was one of the most combative ones we had, and he was practicing martial arts as if he was wearing full restraints, belly chain, leg irons. Evidently was pretty good at it too. Edit, a word. I work in a psych hospital for the criminally insane. Basically, the same thing as a C.O, but we can't defend ourselves if we get attacked. Oh, and they are diagnosed with a mental illness. One time I was watching someone sleep, for behavioral reasons. We will call him Bob. Bob is dead asleep, snoring away at 3 a.m. Suddenly wakes up and yells at our new leader is Megatron, and goes back to snoring. It was reported he watched Transformers that day. I'm not a guard, but my class toured a county jail once. As the sheriff took us past the padded cell, he pointed out several chip marks in the small glass window. Turns out an inmate had pulled out her own tooth and attempted to chip through the window with it. Non-but or poop story. I worked at a county jail for an internship during my last semester at college. School and the jail were over 100 miles from my hometown. One night doing rounds on one of the more secured units, one of the inmates called me over and just started a regular conversation with me. In the middle of talking he asked about my mother by name. Okay, maybe he just got lucky and guessed her name. The inmates only know our last names, and no one called each other by their first names. I'm curious at this point. I play along and say she's doing well. He then goes on to ask me about the rest of my family, including my dog, all by name. Now I'm freaked out and I look up his information. Guy's not even from the same state. To this day don't know how he got all that information. Because of how our facility is set up, the inmates are able to drain the toilet in their cell and talk through it to random inmates in other housing units. Once in a while, you'll walk by a cell doing a round and see a guy hunhed over the toilet, talking into it through a rolled-up magazine. I was guard in a county jail in the south. Each night we would have the inmates stand at the bars of their cell for a head count. On this particular night, I had watch over 25 inmates. After going down the row, I ended with 26. Thinking it was a simple mistake, I recounted. I counted 26 again. I immediately got my superior on the radio. He went down the row and counted 25. I thought I was losing my mind until he informed me that one of the inmates was new and had replaced an inmate who had killed himself earlier that week. I'm still trying to disprove what I saw. Worked in psychiatry and I'm checking everyone for safety. I walk into this bedroom and a nude had made a pyramid on his bed out of furniture, high roof, and was balanced dangerously on top of it, pouring milk in his eye. I worked on a juvenile psych unit. I had to put a girl in restraints that included her head when she started biting chunks out of her own shoulder. Maybe 3 years later I took a bus to interview for a graduate psych program. When I switched buses, a nicely dressed girl asked me if I was from Colorado. I said yes. Then she asked me if I worked on a psych unit. It was her, all better. We chatted for a while and I told her how happy I was to see her doing so well. She smiled, thanked me, and we said our goodbyes. Please for the love of God do an AMA. As someone who wants to be in corrections, I want to read that. Edit, I didn't expect this kind of feedback and thank you to everyone that shared your stories. But if you let others influence a dream, then it's not really a dream but a passing fancy. This is not what this is for me. If you have other options, pursue those. It will suck your soul away. My dad told me I was becoming very cold-hearted. What you failed to realize was the turbine was actually powering a hidden tiny origami paper drill that was skillfully, yet slowly drilling a tiny hole to freedom into the floor. If only you allowed it to run for another few hundred years, it could have worn away the paint on the floor. LMO, that's dedication to gains, getting his protein in any way he can. Might be a mod over at r/gainit. Edit, so the replies below make sense. Originally I tried to help this guy out by telling him his link wasn't blue, and I fixed it by doing this WTF. My neighbor was some top-level prison guard. He didn't have to deal with prisoners on a daily basis from what I understand. He worked at a prison where a convicted murderer escaped, third time, ran into a cop at a railroad, convinced him he was a local and got away. Found him a year later in Canada. Anyways, neighbor told us about how one time they found a prisoner had decapitated his cellmate. One problem, his head was nowhere to be found. Prisoner stomped it to pieces then flushed it down the toilet. That was the story that did wonders for me. Wow, never heard that, but yes, it sounds very similar. I remember one day the inmate was really freaking out and crying. I asked him what was wrong and he told me another inmate told him that Jeff escaped and ran away. I then spent the next 15 minutes walking around the unit looking for an invisible imaginary damn dog. Finally he saw Jeff and everything was better. Some are faking, but some really are that mental. Most of the state's mental hospitals have either been shut down or greatly reduced. These people have to go somewhere and sadly it's usually the slammer. Honestly, the fact that it wasn't someone wanting to fight me made me happy enough, and as a man they wouldn't make me physically remove the radio myself anyway. It was a win-win, and Hootie really made it a special moment. This actually happens in Brazil. Prisoners are allowed to ride a bike which provides electricity back to the prison in exchange for a reduced, marginally, like a fraction of a day, sentence. Apparently behavior issues are curbed, and the population has responded well to the concept. Saltpeter, aka potassium nitrate. There is a popular myth that it causes sexual impotence, which is false, and yet another popular myth is that military training centers spike the water with it to keep the recruits, who are mostly still horny teens, under control. It was a long-term facility that was the best ran place of anywhere in the 4 states where I've worked. It was always a treat when one of the kids, all grown up, would come back to visit after becoming successful. My aunt worked in, may still or gotten out, a juvenile detention center, and every time I would see her, like every few months, she slowly got more and more literal, serious, cold, distrustful, like she saw only the bad in people. She was still cool and not like in our cases, but it was clear for me. Now that I think of it, maybe it was because she always worked in a negative environment. I remember the stories she would tell of having to hold down kids and restrain them. She always scared us straight. Oh man, that's tough. It's one of those things that isn't necessarily a morality issue than an honest mistake. Of course that goes out the window if drugs are involved. Glad to hear you're out though. Yeah, no drugs or alcohol or ID, likely still be in prison and not out on house arrest. Fucked up part is my lawyer was friends with a psychiatrist and he said he could get me diagnosed with narcolepsy for $5,000, but I don't want to go to hell if there is one, and I'm already fucked up enough from the accident as is. Lying about the whole thing to get off scot-free would probably lead to me killing myself. My parents didn't understand initially, but I was adamant in the fact that I was not going to do that. Can confirm. It's mostly officers. We had one officer leaning over the gun rail making a drug deal. He didn't know that his radio was being keyed on when he leaned on the rail, so we heard the whole thing. He was relieved of his duty and fired. That could have been your father, and then you'd have never existed. Then you wouldn't have posted this comment, but would I still have scrolled past the space where your comment would have been? Would everything have been different? Maybe you are the reason Reddit exists at all, and if you hadn't been born, some chain of events could have caused Reddit to just not be a thing. Yes, I'm a little high. Sorry. Then I decided that I was a lemon for a couple of weeks. I kept myself amused all that time jumping in and out of a gin and tonic. Arthur cleared his throat, and then did it again. Where, he said, did you find a gin and tonic? Said Ford brightly. I found a small lake that thought it was a gin and tonic, and jumped in and out of that. At least, I think it thought it was a gin and tonic. I may, he added with a grin which would have sent sane men scampering into the trees, have been imagining it. One of my fave exchanges from H2G2, thanks for bringing it to mind, smiley face. I'm not an asshole. This man was truly very upset. I worked around him 8 hours a day 5 days a week for around 6 months. He had a low IQ and was obviously not of sound mind. Myself along with several of the inmates who had been on the unit a while were fairly protective of the guy. I don't get all the sympathy here. He killed someone because he can't stay awake while driving a car, yet he intends to start driving again when he gets his license back. It's not hard to stay awake while driving if you feel tired. Pull over. He ended someone's life. The food preppers also are usually sitting out fines. So if an inmate is sitting out, say, a failed to pay traffic warrant totaling $300, then each day without work pays $25 or $30. If they work, it pays $50 to $60 a day. I can only imagine how pissed I'd be if I went to jail over a debt, made $60 per day plus room and board in jail, then had to go back out and be unable to find a job that pays that well. The 95 years thing is just the prosecutors adding up the maximums for each charge and trying to scare him into a plea deal. If he had been convicted, it's incredibly unlikely he would have served that long. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.